before we start this video, there are a few things I want to point out in advance. I am not an audio engineer or studio engineer. I'm just a structural/building engineer who has a hobby interest in audio, and I do not have golden ears. I want to point out that this video is not about comparing DAWs in regards to audio quality. I just want to test certain behaviors of them in regards to my own observations with my own mixing process, and I just wanted to verify their behaviors. So with that being said, let's start the video. So welcome again. It is time to dive into a bit of a rabbit hole, and it's potentially a little bit of a touchy subject regarding to how DAWs behave with their audio engines and the way they sum audio channels and whether they do some sort of auto processing. This is not going to be a DAW comparison test like which one sounds better, because I think that's a bit irrelevant. And well, that test has been done by many other people, although I will be doing a null test just to show that some DAWs do exactly create the same output because of mathematical reasons. But there are some very interesting observations with some DAWs that I use, for instance Gadget and also GarageBand on the iPad. They do a few strange things, and the question is, why do I want to dive into this rabbit hole? Well, I normally just kind of start making my music with Gadget, and then I export stems out of it, and I also export like a sort of rough version, just an audio export with all the levels kind of at unity gain, and then I start mixing it with Cubases and then Cubase. And once my mixing process is done, I see quite big differences in loudness levels and dynamic range, whereas the original unmixed version in Gadget is quite dynamic. Often after my entire mixing process in Cubase, the levels and the volume is significantly lower and the dynamic range is reduced a bit. And I was wondering, is this all just part of my mixing process? Is it what I'm doing to the material, or is there something inherently different between the iPad and the PC and the DAWs and how they export things? So I thought to do a little bit of an experiment. I just want to export some stems from Gadget and import them in different DAWs and do a very straight unmixed version, just an export, to see if there are differences. So yeah, I know many people do these sort of tests to prove that there are no sound differences between DAWs because they do a null test, and I will doing a null test as well, just to kind of prove that mathematically summing audio is just, well, very straight process. It's just summing decibels together. But still I want to know if there are differences in cases where things don't null out, what are the reasons for them? And it seems like that Gadget and GarageBand do some weird things, but I can explain them. So let's first take a look at my initial project where I observed some differences. So this here is a recent project of mine that I have mixed in Cubase, and it's complete. And what I often do is also add some of the in-between stages just as references. For instance, here is the original mix down from Gadget, and here is the Cubase's mix. That is kind of a rough mix of the project. So I usually kind of start mixing in Cubases by importing the stems from Gadget, and then after a certain stage I move the project into Cubase on the PC, and then oopsie, the loudness is a lot lower. And yeah, I've done some different tests here, and I cannot really figure out why this was happening. But it just seems to me that after all that mixing stuff, I mean all these different loudness things, well, yeah, you get significantly lower volume, and yeah, it just has a lot of effect. So let's take a look at some images. This is the Gadget export, just a straight version, just a stereo mix down of the project without any mixing at all. So this is fairly pure, just not mixed. And as you can see, it's fairly dynamic here also. But now let's take a look at the comparisons. For instance, this is kind of what happens after I'm done in Cubase, after I've done all my mixing. And yeah, it's lesser dynamic and the loudness is a bit lower. so I had to put it into Wavelab to kind of bring it up a bit. Well, and this is well, what happens after I've put it in Wavelab through some sort of mastering chain. You can see that it is a little bit louder again, but yeah, a lot of stuff happens just in the mixing process. So what could possibly happen? So as you can see, those differences were quite significant, starting from the original unmixed version in Gadget all the way to the final mix from Cubase. A lot of stuff just happens with the dynamic range and the loudness. So I decided to create a very simple 8-track test project. I exported 8 stems from Gadget and I imported them in various different DAWs and did a stereo mixdown. I also did a export from Gadget itself, just to see how things compare. So let's take a look at that. I created a spreadsheet with all my test results. This is the project structure. This is a Gadget project with just 8 tracks. I've exported them at 24-bit 48 kHz, both the stems and a stereo mixdown, and I've also done that at 16-bit and 44.1 kHz because I wanted to know if there are some differences there, and yes, there are some differences when it comes to sample rate and bit depth. At least there's a difference between 24-bit and 16-bit and 44.1 kHz and 48 kHz. But let's just take a look at some of the things. This is the 16-bit export test. I tested Gadget as the reference, Cubases on the iPad, Cubase Elements on the PC and Ableton Live Lite on a PC. And as you can see, Cubases, Cubase and Ableton produce exactly the same results. The same integrated loudness, the same loudness range, the same average dynamics, the same momentary max, the same short-term max, the same true peaks. The only one that's different here is Gadget. And the same thing happens with the 48 kHz test. So you can see that the figures are slightly different for the 24-bit 48 kHz test, but still Cubases, Cubase and Ableton produce the same results, but Gadget is a bit different. As you can see that the average dynamics here is a little bit different, as well as the loudness range. Also the true peak is different, which means that Gadget will not null out. Cubases, Cubase and Ableton all completely null out if I perform the Nulltest. So the reason why Gadget doesn't null out is because every export that you do will be slightly different. I've tested this. I have a project with 90 BPM and no swing, so there should be no tempo variations. But there are some analog instruments in that project. So what happens is this: 3 exports of the same project. Exactly the same project with the same settings, same bit depth, same frequency, but just done at different moments in time, at different hours of the day, so to speak. And you can see that some very small differences exist here. The short-term max here is different, the momentary max is different, even the average dynamics changes and the loudness range. And a very simple reason for that is Gadget is not a traditional DAW like a DAW where you can import stems, but it is a sequencing instrument, and it has its own instruments that emulate analog behaviors of analog synths. I have not done this test with only digital synths. I just wanted to know why is Gadget different than the other 3, and it's because of the fact that every export from Gadget itself is different and won't null out because of the analog emulation. So here's a comparison overview, very detailed. I also did some tests with GarageBand, and I'll get to that a bit later because GarageBand is really strange in some ways. So here's all the different tests. And here are the different passes from Gadget itself. However, I also did a 16-bit 44.1 kHz import and a 24-bit 44.1 kHz mixdown. Why? Well, because that's how GarageBand works. Yeah, I also tested GarageBand, and GarageBand was very frustrating to use, and I just wanted to know why the figures are so off, why they are so different. That just, puzzled me a bit until I found out that there's something going on with a built-in auto limiter that you cannot disable. I thought I had made a user error because, well, the figures were so different, but nope. This seems to be a well-documented problem with GarageBand. As you can see, the loudness is very different, as well as the loudness range in the true peaks. And yeah, it's just the built-in auto limiter that is just, well, screwing things up. For instance, this is GarageBand's output. So you can see that its integrated loudness here is -15, whereas like Ableton does like 16.9. Also, loudness range differs, and it's just that, well, GarageBand does weird shit. So let's take a look at the Nulltest. So this is the 24-bit 48 kHz Nulltest. And if I play Cubasis and Ableton at the same time, well, let's first just play the reference track, which is Gadget. It sounds like this. Now Cubasis, Cubase Elements, and Ableton. Well, they pretty much sound the same, but you will see some differences in loudness. And yeah, Gadget is a little bit different. So let's take a look at the Nulltest. I will now play Cubasis and Cubase Elements simultaneously, and I will flip the phase on this one. Complete silence, because they are mathematically completely identical. Both Cubasis and Cubase Elements do the exact same things. They just add dBs, and yes, for the record, I'm very aware of the pen law, but because I have all the pen pots in the center position and all the faders at unity gain, that shouldn't be a difference. It shouldn't be a problem. So now let's compare a few others. Let's restore the phase on this one, and now let's compare Cubase against Ableton. So flip the phase on Ableton. Again, complete silence. It cancels out. Now Cubasis at Ableton. Flip the phase again. It's silent. So now Gadget and Cubasis. Flip the phase on Cubasis. And you will hear things. And that makes total sense, because the Yulin loudness meter measurements showed it, that there were numerical differences, and that's because of Gadget's randomization. So that to me seems that, well, I don't have to worry about those audio engines themselves. They are perfectly fine if you input the same stems and have the faders all at unity gain and the pen pots at center position, and if the bit depth and sample rate are identical, they will produce identical results, or at least when it comes to Cubasis, Cubase and Ableton and possibly many others. It's just that, well, you have to be aware that you're not chasing a red herring, because Gadget does, by design, randomize its output every time if you have analog emulations in them, because Gadget is not a DAW in which you can actually import audio and export it. Yeah, it's not really an audio DAW. It creates audio, but you can't really import audio into it. So that is something you have to take into account. And well, GarageBand, from what I've seen in other videos, where people complain that their export was too loud or too quiet, it's because of GarageBand's auto limiter, and I may put some links in the description with some demonstrations of this, because I think it's quite problematic that GarageBand is doing that. I'm well aware that the desktop version of GarageBand has an option to turn the auto limiter off, but in the iPad version you can't, and there are some really ugly hacks to fool the auto limiter. I think I'll have some B-roll footage where I just demonstrate these different DAWs, my import process, and some of the frustrations with GarageBand. I think GarageBand is quite clunky to use in some ways. It's one of the reasons I don't use it, but yeah, if you use it, good for you. Yeah, I just hope you can put up with its clunkiness, but the actual DAWs themselves, when sample rate, bit depth are equal and you use the same stems, yeah, they should output the same loudness, and at least Gadget is in the same ballpark as Cubase. So it's not really a PC versus iPad difference here. The audio engines behave all the same as you would expect. I hope that makes sense. But what about the actual audio summing? Because these different DAWs, they are just, well, summing together audio samples. And it's just a mathematical process. And I'm aware that some DAWs like Harrison Mixbus emulate an analog console and that it doesn't null out. But in the cases where things do null out, like Ableton and Cubase, why is that? And well, how do those audio engines exactly work? So Ableton have, well, put up this fact sheet. They have done various tests with their audio engine and they talk about neutral operations. And that is basically what I was kind of testing here as well. When audio signals are added together, are the steps repeatable? Are they deterministic? And yeah, in a lot of cases they are, except if there are some non-neutral operations that change the audio, like what GarageBand, for instance, is doing with its auto limiter, or Gadget with its randomization. Then you could consider that to be non-neutral. So Ableton have done a lot of tests with their own software. And yeah, even though I don't really like Ableton's UI, I think its audio engine is perfectly good, just as good as Cubase when it just comes to the mathematical aspects of it. In fact, they have a 64-bit engine, and the versions of Cubase that I use still have a 32-bit engine, but newer versions have a 64-bit engine. But what is the actual summing of audio like? Well, if you just take pure audio samples or just audio sources and you add them together, it is a logarithmic addition. It's not that 2 dB plus 2 dB is 4 dB. No, it is actually a little bit different because of logarithmics. If I have two sources and I have 2 dB and 2 dB, you see that it is 5.01. I can also have like 8 sources and just take some random stuff. And the result is 16.48 dB. So that is basically happening here with all these little samples. When you have like 8 different stems, you add them together, software exports them, it all adds up those decibels. And well, yeah, if things are done in an equal way, they output in an equal way, and you can flip the phase on them and they will null out. But if things are not equal, like with GarageBand or Gadget, because of its randomization, things will not null out. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I clearly wanted to avoid digging into the rabbit hole of audio quality, because there's, yeah, I know it's very touchy subject and I absolutely do not want to touch that at all. I just wanted to figure out well, if the DAWs are producing repeatable results, if they do some weird things with my audio, because I think that what GarageBand is doing is totally unacceptable. It is applying an auto limiter to your audio that you cannot turn off. And I think that's just horrible, because it will kill your dynamic range in some unfortunate cases. And in other cases it will have the result that it will make your audio too quiet, or it would make it way too loud. The auto limiter is just horrible. But luckily, well, decent DAWs like Cubase and Ableton don't do that sort of shit. They just won't touch your audio if you leave all the faders at the center position. They just do purely mathematical process. They don't muck about. So at least they are all in the same ballpark as Gadget, and that's what I wanted to test. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed it and thanks for watching. Bye bye.